Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Ask Effective Questions in Order to Connect More Meaningfully with Your Mentor. This webinar is developed for CPA Ontario students, but we are pleased that there are candidates from other provinces joining us. My name is Tashkia Masamet, and I'm a specialist on the Employer Relations team. I will be your moderator today. Please note, all participants are muted. However, please feel free to write your questions in the questions panel on the right-hand side, and we will be happy to respond to your questions either directly or the presenters will answer at the Q&A portion of this webinar. Throughout this presentation, we will also be taking quick polls which you can answer. A recording of this presentation will be sent out to all participants the next day. Please note, a copy of this presentation is also available for participants to download in the handout section. There is also a one-page handout for this presentation that you can download after the webinar. You can find these under the handout section on the panel in the right-hand side of your screen. We are now ready to start our presentation. I am very pleased to welcome our presenter, Taylor Buonocore-Guthrie, to our webinar. Good afternoon, Taylor. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar.
Thank you so much for that welcome. It's a delight to be here with all of you, and thank you to everyone for joining. I see the numbers just climbing here. So as you all get set in the room, I'm going to do a brief introduction and then we'll launch right into our content today. Here on the screen, you can see a picture of myself and my partner, Mollie. We are the founders of Conversate, which is a methodology for conversation rooted in asking effective questions. And to shake things up just a bit this morning, I'm going to share my live webcam with you to break this up here and not just be in slides. So hello, everyone. My name is Taylor, and I'll share a little bit about myself before we get into the slide deck and really build your skill set today. My background is in management consulting, and I've always been involved with building teams in mostly a global context and cross-culturally and also across sectors. So this topic in particular is really of interest to me because of the importance of team building and those mentor relationships for growing personal skill sets, but also organizations as a whole. And because over time, in my personal mentoring relationships, I've seen the role that questions and curiosity can play in really guiding you to develop professionally in a way that is driven by you and a way in which you seek the answers and find the answers within yourself rather than being told sort of what to do. So today we're going to talk about that and think about how you can use questions as a tool in your mentoring relationship. So with that, let me launch us in here. I want to also spend a moment as we begin thinking about the present moment that we're in. Because this is a unique moment in time, and there are some events happening in the world which are certainly unusual. At the time of this recording, we're in the midst of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and so I recognize that some of you, many of you in fact, may be working from home in offices that don't look like where you normally spend your time. Perhaps there are children or pets who are normally not with you accompanying you for this webinar today. So I want to spend a moment acknowledging the moment that we're in. Thank you for being here, and invite you to use this hour to really develop yourself and elevate a skill set that you have that will serve you for the long term in your mentoring relationship and also, we hope, professionally. So thank you everyone for being here, and I invite you to really give your full attention. Our purpose today is to think about how, as you work towards mastering your CPA enabling competencies and ultimately achieve your CPA designation, how can you meaningfully connect with your mentor to make the absolute most out of your mentor relationship? Because that mentoring relationship really serves you in your journey towards that goal of your designation. Now, at its core, a mentor relationship is about learning and it's about connection. It really is a special opportunity for you to be paired along with someone who, frankly, before they even meet you, is excited to learn about you and really walk alongside you as you start your accounting career. That is a special opportunity in itself. And in order to make the most of that relationship, I'm going to encourage you to think of it as your job to make it easy for your mentor to help you. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you get the most out of that mentor relationship while enjoying yourself along the way? And we want to keep in mind, of course, the CPA values and behaviors, as well as your CPA enabling competencies, and point out that communication, self-management, teamwork, and leadership in particular, those are competencies that really can be activated by how you approach your mentor relationship. With that, let's consider a poll. And our first poll is, who is the driver of the mentor-mentee relationship? I'll read through these answers and then we're going to activate the poll and you will have a chance as an audience to weigh in here. So is it A, you, B, your mentor, or C, both of you? I'm going to activate the poll now. Please respond and we'll give you a couple seconds to weigh in. Awesome, a lot of votes coming in here. We're over 50% responded already. So if you haven't weighed in yet, 5, 4, 3, 2, squeeze in those last couple votes. All right, the poll is closed. Okay. 45% of you believe that you are the driver, 2% view the mentor as the driver, and 53% say we both are. All right, so this is interesting. We have a split between considering your role as the mentee being the driver of the relationship, and also folks who are thinking really that the mentor and the mentee are both driving. Now, of course, you each have an important role to play in your mentoring relationship, but I would point out it's easy to assume that this mentor-mentee split, perhaps the responsibility relies on both of you. I would encourage you, as part of this relationship that you have with CPA, to think of yourself as the driver of this relationship. And here's why. Usually the mentor-mentee relationship is a hierarchical one, especially because mentors typically, but not always, tend to be in a more senior position. Perhaps they have more years of experience, professional experience. Perhaps you're in the same organization and this person actually sits above you. But the most successful mentoring relationships, the traditional leader or the driver role is actually flipped from this hierarchy. Mentees who are in the driver's seat tend to get the most out of their mentoring relationships. And why might that be? Well, although mentors may have walked in your shoes before, they are not on your unique path. So even though we both have responsibility, the mentor and the mentee, for moving this relationship forward, only you know how you'd most like to grow. And so it's really helpful for you to take primary ownership of your mentoring relationship. And in practice, that means logistical things like setting up your calls or meetings, preparing conversation topics and questions that you'd like to ask your mentor. We'll talk a lot more about that in this webinar. It also means driving the conversation and being open to take a lead with sharing your experiences and your challenges in a way that's most helpful for your own growth and your own development. So again, while we all have responsibility here, your mentor and your mentee both have responsibility, you will benefit most if you take the driver's seat and you really drive this forward to tailor your conversations to what's going to be most helpful for you. So let's talk about some tips for how to effectively drive that relationship and get the most out of your mentoring relationship. We're going to talk about you as the driver, and specifically using the tool set of asking great questions in each of your interactions with your mentor. And we call this a question-led approach to mentorship. So as we begin talking about this question-led approach, I want to acknowledge that I'll also be speaking with your mentors in a separate webinar this week, where we talk about what role they play and how mentors can also ask questions as part of your mentoring relationship. Not only will the focus be on how you can lead with questions, but also how you can be a good recipient of questions from your mentor today. And the goal for everyone is learning and connection, and asking and receiving good questions will help both you and your mentor on that journey. Okay, so what makes an effective question? We all know what questions are intuitively, right? And we know how to ask them. We start doing this from when we're children. And if you have kids now, you know that they're constantly asking you things out of curiosity. And in fact, you probably still do this daily at work now and at home. After all, questions, they're a very important way that we learn and access information. Questions take on many different forms, and in our work over the years as facilitators, we've found that there are generally two characteristics behind the most effective questions, because you can ask a question, but it isn't necessarily effective. So what makes an effective question? Well, first is a mindset of curiosity. What does curiosity look like to you? Just take a moment and consider this. What does curiosity look like to you? Perhaps think about someone that you'd consider to be particularly curious. Now, some words we often hear to describe curiosity are interested, wondering, intrigued, eager to know or learn something. Sometimes people even say a curious person is someone who asks questions, or perhaps researches or examines something closely to know or learn something. Right? You're getting a sense for what curiosity looks like in practice. And in fact, at a recent CPA Ontario conference that happened last year, one of the speakers was quoted as saying that he believes the world will be dominated by the intellectually curious in the future. So, mentoring relationship aside, this is a really good muscle to strengthen. And here's the thing, even if you aren't naturally that curious, or you don't feel like you have the energy on any given day, today perhaps, to be your most naturally curious self, there is a practice that can instantly energize your curiosity, and it's called beginner's mind. I'd love to see, just in the chat function here, let us know if you're familiar with this mindset of beginner's mind. Beginner's mind is essentially having an attitude of openness and a freedom from preconceptions, even when you're studying at an advanced level, just the same way a beginner would. So what this means in practice is, even if you know a lot about whatever it is you're talking about, or you think you know a lot about it, to adopt the mindset of someone who perhaps is encountering this just for the first time. And what that enables you to do is look at this with totally fresh eyes and suddenly feel curiosity that you may not have felt at the outset. This is an incredibly powerful tool, and even the person that is the most expert in whatever topic can learn new things by adopting this beginner's mind. Phrased another way, I often say is, if you had the chance to learn everything you possibly could about X being whatever the topic is, this is your chance, right? If you're at a dinner party and someone strikes up a conversation about stamps, let's say, and you're not a stamp collector, you're not particularly interested in stamps, well, this is your moment to learn everything that you can about that. So in the context of your mentoring relationship, using a beginner's mind can help you think about skill sets, challenges, and opportunities that you think you maybe have handled in a new way, and enable you to ask questions of your mentor with a mindset of curiosity that may actually unlock new perspectives for you. And that's what this is all about, enabling you to grow in the most effective way possible. Okay, so just for fun, which of these items are you personally most curious about? 1, how the accounting industry is changing. 2, your mentor's career path. Or 3, the CPA exam. And I'm going to activate a poll. I'm really curious myself to hear what everyone is thinking here. So the poll is launched. Select which item you are personally more curious about. Okay. 70% voted. There's a lot of curiosity that's being activated here. 5 more seconds. Get in those last votes. All right, so you answered what you're most curious about. Now, right before I reveal the answers here, consider, what do you think the majority of the group said? There's a clear winner. Okay, if you asked yourself, or you thought curiosity-wise, how is the accounting industry changing? You are with the majority of the group here. Almost half of our audience today is most interested in this topic. Another quarter of you curious about your mentor's career path, and the last quarter curious about the CPA exam. Now, the great news is that these are 3 topics that you might actually discuss with your mentor. So you already have a couple things that you might begin to explore, and being able to ask about something from a place of genuine curiosity is extremely effective for establishing connection and keeping a conversation going. In the context of your mentor relationship, or even a colleague relationship where you're assigned or paired up with another person, it can be really common to ask questions that you think you're supposed to ask. Like, what advice do you have for someone who's just getting started like me? Raise your hand to yourself if you've ever asked someone that question before. Now, although it's a great question, what advice do you have for someone who's getting started like me? In order to make the most of your mentor relationship, which is this really special relationship where this person is truly invested in your progress as a professional, it's critical that your questions come from a place of true curiosity. So ask yourself, what do you actually want to know? That sense of curiosity, if you really let yourself tap into it, is going to be a great guide for you. Now, the second characteristic of effective questions is that they're generally open-ended. And this is probably a term that you're familiar with. Even you learn this in primary school. What is an open-ended question? Well, they're usually kicked off by some key words, some of which are highlighted here on this slide. So for the purposes of learning and reinforcing some of what we already know, let's convert some closed-ended questions that you might find yourself asking your mentor into open-ended questions. You might say something like, do you enjoy being a CPA? And instead, to make this more open and not just yes, I do or no, I don't, although presumably the answer is yes for everyone you're speaking with, you can say, what do you enjoy most about being a CPA? Now you've unlocked, rather than just a yes, I do enjoy my career, a whole wealth of knowledge that you can tap into and a whole bunch of information that's going to give you content to further probe on and ask about with your mentor. Instead of saying a question like, is the busy season difficult for you? Presumably the answer to that is yes for most people as well. You can ask a question like, what do you do to prepare effectively for the busy season? Now, here it gets interesting. There's probably all kinds of information that your mentor can share with you and strategies and tips that you can learn from. Instead of saying, is it challenging to build a book of clients? Of course it has challenges. Ask, how have you acquired new client relationships? I'm sure each mentor will have their own answer to this question, and it opens up a wealth of conversation that you can have with your mentor. These are really simple switches that you can make starting today to open up your questions. And in doing this small change, you're really going to invite the other person to think and to share and hold space for them to do that. I also think it's really important to note that asking closed questions is something we usually do out of habit. The questions that start with can, have, do, does, and should. Just observe yourself for the rest of the day and try to catch yourself asking a closed-ended question. I promise you I will do this afternoon, and I'm the one talking to you about how to ask effective questions. It truly is a habit-driven thing that we do, and making an active practice of thinking about how you ask your questions is the first step. This simple switch is so effective for opening up conversation and really giving you access to information and learning. Okay, quick quiz. Which of these question starters will allow for an open-ended question? The word how, the word have, the word why. Let me activate this poll. Okay, votes pouring in. How, have, or why? Get those last votes in. 3, 2, 1. Okay, close poll. Now I'm realizing you may not have had a multiple choice option here, but clearly the two questions that are dominating are how and why. And you are correct here. How you can often use as how might we, or how might you, as a helpful opener to problem solving. It can also be used the way that we did in our last example. And why is really helpful for digging into reasons and perhaps strategies for how to tackle a problem. Now, one word of caution on the word why. Tone is really important when you ask a question why, because it can trigger a defensive response. Have you ever had someone ask you why and you immediately feel a little bit defensive as to why you did something and the need to justify? You want to be careful in the tone that you use. So you can listen for the difference here. Why did you decide not to work on that particular internal client project? Versus, why did you decide not to work on that particular internal client project? The first presentation of that sentence has a tone that seems a little skeptical, perhaps a little suspicious, and perhaps indicates that I don't think that that was a good decision. Whereas the second presentation attempts to be much more open. Now, it's worth rehearsing the way that you ask questions. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar as well. It feels silly to say some things out loud before you introduce them in conversation, but particularly when you're asking something that could be perceived in a certain way, it's worth saying it out loud for yourself to make sure that the way that you say it is the way that you actually want it to come across. Okay. Now, time to get into the nitty-gritty here. These are 3 types of questions for your toolbox. Today, we're going to talk about permission questions, follow-up questions, and scaling questions. And before we begin, I just want to say that in the handout section of the webinar, the PDF of this presentation is available. Don't feel like you need to feverishly take notes because there are a lot of examples presented in here and they are all captured in the handout section with this presentation. So first, let's talk about permission questions. Now, a permission question is delivered exactly the way that it's named. You literally are asking permission. Now, you may wonder, why would you ask permission as part of asking a question? Well, have you ever been curious about something, but felt a little awkward to ask it? Maybe you had a question about a potentially sensitive topic. Maybe you felt like this question was, quote, one of those silly questions and shouldn't be asked, which frankly is never true. You should always ask what you're wondering about. But if you feel a little awkward or it feels like it could be sensitive, pave the way with a permission question. The permission question eases the awkwardness, and it also gives the person you're speaking to an opportunity to either accept or decline your question. And when your request is accepted, you're both proceeding on the same page, which removes any of the awkwardness that there could have been and lets you talk about something that you truly are curious about. So let's talk through some examples. A common time to ask for permission is likely something that you already do, noticing when someone seems distracted or openly discloses that something pressing is on their mind or agenda. So for example, let's say your mentor emails you a few minutes before your scheduled call to let you know that they might be a few minutes late due to a client situation. You can use a permission question in this situation, something like, is now still a good time to connect? That's a great question to lead with here because it asks for permission to use the time the way you had initially planned. And if you do proceed, you've both implicitly agreed to give your full attention. If you decide to postpone the call and you've given the chance for your mentor to be honest with you and say, you know what, it's not actually a good time for this call, you can expect that when you do connect at a better time, you'll have full attention and the call will be much more productive for both of you, which is important, right? That's how you want this to be. Another example might be exploring a curiosity that you have to learn more about a personal choice or a personal story. And asking permission in this case is basically an invitation for the other person to share. So for example, you could say, would it be okay if I asked you more about how you made your decision to change companies at that point? Or another question could be, are you open to sharing a little bit more about your family? I'd love to learn how you personally balanced your family life with your career. That's something that's important to me. Now, those questions invite your mentor to share a little bit more with you. And if you're like me, the answers to those questions really would be interesting to me, and I think would really help you consider yourself in light of someone else's experiences. And it's helpful to ask permission because it is possible that your mentor doesn't feel comfortable for whatever reason. A third use of permission questions comes in the form of delivering feedback or in offering advice. And those questions sound like this. Would it be okay if I share an observation or a point of feedback with you? Or would it be okay if I offered some advice? Now, there's one other thing to be aware of when you're asking permission questions, and I've hinted at this. Almost always people say yes. As in our first example, keep in mind that if they do say no, it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's actually a good thing. If it's not a good time to connect or someone would rather not share further about their family, they have the chance to let you know, and then they can steer the conversation elsewhere. So don't be afraid of a no here. Use the permission question to your advantage to be able to unlock topics that you might not normally talk about. And if you get a no, take that as a sign that you can move on and talk about something else. And ultimately, you will have achieved deeper connection, whether the answer is a yes or a no, because of the opportunity to really speak honestly and authentically with each other. You've given choice with a permission question. Next up, follow-up questions. This is perhaps the most important and I think the most underutilized question of them all. Now, why is that? Well, what I observe is that we typically accept answers at face value and move on. And I observe this in personal and in professional contexts. Have you ever been in a conversation where you receive an answer, but pursue it a bit further, and you realize that by asking additional questions that build on each other to go deeper, you receive real, unexpected, and valuable answers? I'm sure your answer to that is yes. And yet, the same way that we make a habit of asking closed questions, we kind of make a habit of accepting an answer at face value and moving on. Said another way, oftentimes the real answer is not the first response, but it instead comes when you go a layer deeper. So here's a really simple example. Imagine that you're asking a family member about their day. I'm sure you do this at least once a week. You say, "How was your day?" And the person responds, "It was good." And you say, "That's great." Well, if we don't say anything else after "that's great," we've totally missed an opportunity to learn a little bit more. So instead of just responding with, "Good, that's great," you can say something like, "Well, what was something particularly good about it?" Now you've opened up the dialogue. You're inviting a whole lot more response. Even this can be used with your mentor when you say, "How are you today?" Which is pretty much how we open every conversation. There's always an opportunity there to follow up on whatever the person's answer is. And there's a couple different reasons to use follow-up questions. We'll talk through some of these examples in the next few slides as a way to organize the whole variety of follow-up questions that you can tap into. One of these categories is to ask for clarification. So some of the examples are here on your screen. To ask for clarification, you can say something as simple as, can you share an example? So if someone says, yes, it's been a challenging day at work. I have a client that has presented us with a couple different twists and turns, but we're working with them and we're making the best of it. That's something that someone could clearly say in a casual conversation, and you can follow up and say, can you share an example? Now you're inviting them to share an example of this twist and turn and beginning to understand what they mean. Another response could be, interesting, could you say a little bit more about that? Another one is, what else is important to know? Now, the question, what else, is so useful, and it's so simple to keep in your back pocket all the time. You can say what else to all sorts of different responses that people offer you, and it just nudges the door open for them to share anything else that might be important to know. Another clarification follow-up question is, what did you make of that? So if something happens in the company or something happens in the news and you're processing it together, you can ask your mentor, what did you make of that? It's a way to get insight into how someone else is personally affected by something or is mentally processing something that's happening. It's a great way to get personal clarification on a topic. So clarification is one reason to use a follow-up question. Understanding context is another reason to use follow-up questions. The idea of understanding context is beginning to understand where something came from or how it fits into the bigger picture. And for context follow-up questions, you can ask, where did that idea come from? Let's say that your mentor has their own advisory practice and they have decided to pursue a certain line of business. And as you're speaking to them about this, you can ask them, where did your idea for that come from? And there's sure to be an interesting answer behind it. You can also say something like, could you share more about your thought process? This helps you understand how your mentor might be thinking about certain problems, and particularly if they're an experienced professional, give you insight into how they tackle problems. You can also ask, how did this blank, you fill in the blank, whatever the topic would be, how did this come to be? This is an origin question, similar to our first question, where did that idea come from? And origin questions for understanding context, again, just help you understand how something came to be, why you are where you are right now, and some of the thinking behind it. It opens up and really unlocks a whole slew of information and conversation. You can also ask, where do you think that stems from? Now, let's say that we're back to understanding industry trends. More than half of our audience was interested in industry trends. As you talk about these industry trends with your mentor, you can ask them, where do you think that stems from? And understand their insights on why we are where we are. You can also ask follow-up questions to learn about your mentor's personal experience with questions like, what was that like for you? And how has that affected your company? And also, what was most challenging or most encouraging or most inspiring about that? Now, if you don't feel comfortable asking these questions right off the bat, you can pair it with a permission question. Would it be okay if I asked what that was like for you? Would you feel comfortable talking about how that has affected your company? These are two twists on these follow-up questions that incorporate permission alongside it, because these questions are a little bit more personal in nature. Now, when someone conveys a feeling when they're answering these questions, any feeling really, excitement, disappointment, pride, a great follow-up question is to ask this one right here, what was most exciting or challenging, whatever the feeling they expressed was for you. Or something like, if they said it was really disappointing, you can say, what part of it was most disappointing for you? This all is in an effort to help you get to know the other person, learn what matters to them, and it ultimately builds your connection in this mentoring relationship. So before we move on to the next question, just to summarize, follow-up questions, whether you're asking about personal experience, you're understanding the context, or you're asking for clarification, these follow-up questions are all about digging deeper, or to use a metaphor, peeling the layer of the onion back one layer further. They're about getting below the surface and gaining information that isn't always offered on that first share. It's not always shared in the first answer, but it can be critical to your fuller understanding of something. So in fact, we've seen this in practice inside of your mentoring relationship, but also in your relationships with colleagues, with internal customers, with your clients, even with your family. The habit of asking follow-up questions is this kind of skill that sets you apart when you're trying to learn and connect with others. So reflecting on the different types of follow-up questions, consider this next poll. Which follow-up question would you like to begin using? Perhaps even one to try out later today. Is it the question, could you say more about that? Is it what else? What else might be important to know? Or is it a personal question, like, what was that like for you? Let's activate this poll and see what you all think. All right, everybody's thinking. We're almost halfway voted. Could you say more about that? What else might be important to know? Or what was that like for you? Okay, interesting. This split is almost even. So last 5 seconds to get your votes in. Okay, we have one that's pulling ahead. 3, 2, 1. Okay, here are our results. Could you say more about that? Took about 23%. Okay, so a quarter of you, could you say more about that? This again is a question that you can just keep right in your back pocket at all times. You can always ask, could you say more about that? Especially if you don't understand the answer, this question's helpful. What else might be important to know? Yeah, what else is a winner every single time? So almost half of us are interested in using this question today. And then another third, what was that like for you? The personal questions here, especially in a mentoring relationship, can be really, really effective to ask. Again, this is a personal relationship. It's a one-to-one relationship, which is unlike many others that we have in the workplace. And so when you feel comfortable asking these personal questions, even if they're preceded by a permission question, you should do it because it gives you the chance to meaningfully connect with your mentor. And remember, the first step to building your follow-up habit is to make a conscious effort to simply ask the follow-up question, which is why think about what you selected here and truly try to use this before the day is out. Okay. Let's move on to scaling questions. Now, a scaling question, as you can see on our presentation here, adds a little bit of variety and depth to this conversation that you're having by asking someone to rate on a scale. These questions don't happen super frequently in the course of normal conversation. And so when you're connecting with your mentor and you're trying to add a little bit of energy and add a little variety to the questions you're asking, it can be a lighthearted option that invites someone to think differently on a numerical scale and establishes greater understanding with whatever the person's answer is. It also can give you a shared language. So if you ask someone a question, for example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how has your day been? Now, we've known a manager who actually asks her employees this on a daily basis in the afternoons. She goes around and checks in with people and asks this question. So when they say a 6, you can say, how did you choose a 6? It's a great follow-up question, number one. And number two, it's establishing better understanding of what's happening for that person and also a shared language, but it invites them to first respond with a very, very simple, non-confrontational, almost impersonal way to define their day. So scaling questions can be really effective. Another example is on a scale of 1 to 10, this is timely, how badly have your clients been affected by the coronavirus? This gets your mentor perhaps thinking, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, generalizing across all the clients, what does it look like? It invites them to think in a different way. And it's a little different than if you were to just say, how badly have your clients been affected by the coronavirus, right? And then a third example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how challenging was the core 2 as compared to the core 1? This is asking your mentor to reflect on their own personal experience and gives you a little bit of insight into how they view challenge. Now, one note to keep in mind when using the scaling question is to just take a moment and define the 1 and define the 10. Because you want the person to be able to know, is 1 not so good and is 10 so good, or what? You need to establish that shared language with each other, right? Okay, you can also sometimes use humor. You can define 1 as like the worst day of my life and 10 as the best day of my life. I just won $10 billion. And if you are a humorous person, this is a nice chance to let your humor shine through with whatever you equate 1 and 10 to. Okay, now let's think about how often we use scaling questions. How often do you use scaling questions on a regular basis? And we're going to use the scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being never and 10 being all the time. Okay, the poll is launched. All right, it's looking like never is dominating here. So get your last votes in. Tell us, if you are using scaling questions all the time, let us know. All right, 3, 2, 1, polls closed. Okay. Now, never is clearly the dominant one here, with sometimes close behind. So it's nice to see that we're sometimes using these scales to invite people to respond in a different way. And hopefully these techniques have presented a couple new ways for you to do it if you are using these from time to time in your conversations. So let's shift out of ways to ask effective questions and into response techniques, because when you ask a question or you're asked a question, there is this art to how you respond. This is important to know as well, particularly because your mentoring relationship is a conversation. So it's not one-sided. You'll be going back and forth with your mentor, and being thoughtful about how you respond is going to serve you well. We're only going to focus on 2 techniques today. One is patient silence, and one is playback. So let's first talk about silence. Silence is incredibly powerful because it offers a moment to reflect and to think. And in this world where we're constantly bombarded by information and frankly a lot of noise, we rarely have silence. Even on this webinar, there's been relatively little silence, right? Because I'm trying to present this information. But I do want to pause for a moment to let everybody feel what silence feels like. Now, research has shown that it takes about 6 seconds for people to start feeling uncomfortable with silence in the company of others, which is about how long I paused. So if you found yourself thinking, like, where did she go? Is she coming back? Is my webinar still on? Am I still connected here? That feeling of needing to fill the space, even with a conversation in your own head, is very normal. But be aware that silence is powerful. And so if you're asked a good question by your mentor or a colleague or even a friend, it should make you stop and think. It should actually cause a little bit of silence. And take a moment to do that instead of rushing to fill the silence. This is a great response technique to have. Be silent, be still for a moment, and really think about what your response is. It also can be a gift to others to be patient with their silence and allow them the same moment to reflect before you jump in to speak. So This is a response technique for when someone asks you a question, but it's also really important to be aware of this when you're the one that's asking, because if you've asked a good, effective, and thoughtful question, you should expect some silence from your mentor. You should actually expect and allow them to take a moment to process your question, reflect on what they think, and come back to you with a thoughtful answer. In fact, the more silence that you have after your questions, it can indicate that you've tapped into something powerful. You're really inviting them to think carefully before they respond. Okay, next up for our response techniques is playback. Playback is a skill that takes a little practice and really requires you to listen. We all know that listening is an important part of any conversation, communication, and relationship. And this is a way to hone your listening skill. Playback is just what it sounds like. It's literally repeating back what you've heard, but in your own words to make sure that you're hearing the information the way that it was intended. Doing this lets your conversation partner know also that you're really listening and you care about getting it right. You care about processing correctly what they've said. So Mollie and I often run this example when we are presenting together, where Mollie was sharing some examples of questions that she brought to a mentor of hers early in her career as an accountant. She discovered through random sampling of smaller transactions that this client had a recurring payment, and it was actually disguised as rent for an office location that didn't really exist. It was, in fact, a personal residence. But because it was a small amount and it was a recurring payment, it managed to slip by for years. Now, if you were to use this example to demonstrate a playback, which again is a very short version to just recap, it might sound something like this. Well, it sounds like Mollie's client disguised a personal residence as an office location and billed that rental payment to the company. Did I get that right? After summarizing, it's actually always helpful to ask that question, did I get that right? Because the person might say no. And if they do say no, it's not quite right, you'll be able to understand how you misrepresented or misunderstood instead of moving forward with an incorrect assumption. It actually gives you a moment to correct your understanding of something. Now, this can be helpful in your mentoring conversations because particularly as you're understanding how your mentor may have thought about an idea or processed a personal circumstance, being able to play it back confirms that you're really understanding their way of thinking, their personal history, and that you're endeavoring to establish a genuine connection with them and really understand what they think. This is really effective for relationship building. And you can introduce it by saying, could I play that back to make sure I understand? You play it back, and then you can ask, did I get that right? All right. So our two response techniques were silence again and playback. Now, moving on to how to effectively prepare for your mentor meetings. We put together a simple list here, which was reflecting some of what we talked about today. First, we encourage you to really think about your goals. Tap into curiosity here. What do you really want to know from your mentor? Or what do you really want to be able to figure out for yourself as far as your career goals and what you're hoping to professionally develop as part of this relationship? We also encourage you to rehearse your questions. This is the process of shaping your questions that you want to introduce with your mentor, perhaps thinking of a scaling question that might be relevant, or thinking about some topics that you want to address where a permission question could be useful. And also in some cases, rehearsing the tone. Even if it's rehearsing the tone for a why-based question, where you begin with the word why, that isn't necessarily relevant to what you're going to ask and just lets you practice rehearsing the tone. Really rehearse them and shape them effectively. Confirm prior to the meeting. This is part of permission, right? Give yourself the chance to have your mentor let you know that it might not be a good time so that you can confirm that you'll both be on the same page and both attentive for the meeting itself. During your call, focus 100% because this is what enables you to thoughtfully ask a follow-up question and play back. If you're not focused 100% and you allow yourself to get distracted, it is very hard. Take it from personal experience. It's very hard to thoughtfully ask a follow-up question that's relevant. And at the heart of this mentoring relationship is relationship building. And that presence and your attentiveness and your thoughtful questions will really go a long way in helping you do that. Now, immediately after the call, take a moment to reflect on your learning and your next steps. This is actually going to help you circle back to number one again for your next conversation. You can think about what you might like to talk more about next time. In fact, perhaps there was a moment in your conversation where you wanted to ask a follow-up question and you hesitated or didn't feel comfortable, or the conversation just naturally moved in a different direction and you didn't have a chance to ask about it. By reflecting on your conversation, you can identify what that topic might be and then shape a question around it for your next conversation with your mentor. You can invite them to circle back on something that you talked about last time. I don't know about you, but this happens to me more often than I would like, where after the fact, I think to myself, I really would have liked to ask about this. Well, the good news is that you'll have the chance to, and you can shape a question specifically around whatever that is. And then last but not least, always follow up with your mentor and express appreciation after the call. At the heart of these relationships is learning and connection. And so by following up and expressing sincere thanks and perhaps even mentioning something that you're really taking away from that conversation with your mentor, you'll go a long way in establishing a relationship that you can rely on, perhaps even after your formal mentoring relationship has elapsed. Okay, now, those are the steps. We also wanted to equip you with some questions, some thoughtful questions that build on the skills that we've talked about today that you can use with your mentor in both your initial conversation and also your follow-up conversations. And in order to leave time for questions, I won't walk through all of these, but know that in the handouts on the webinar, you can download questions for mentees, and all of these are included on a one-pager. And we invite you to draw on these as you're preparing questions for your conversations with your mentor, and hope that these will be useful to you. Okay, so to wrap up, let's talk about some questions that you have. First of all, right now I'll invite our moderators to share anything that has come in from the audience, and please feel free to use the functions in the webinar to submit anything that you'd like to know more about if you haven't submitted a question already. All right, I'm seeing some comments in here. Just certain topics were resonating. So thank you all for submitting that as well.
So we do have a question about scaling. The student's asking, would that get annoying?
Good question. I think it depends on the style of the person that's using this question. In particular, we know a manager for whom this fits really well. She's someone that likes to walk around the office floor when they're working together, of course, and ask everyone in a very humorous way, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's the day going? It's just a really simple way for her to check in with folks. So I think in her case, it doesn't get annoying, but I can tell you personally, I would not be the type of person to ask a scaling question at every turn. I find these to be most useful when I'm trying to break things up a little bit. It definitely feels more lighthearted to say, scale of 1 to 10, how hard is this challenge that you're in right now? And so it's, for me personally, it's a way to break it up. But you raise a good question, and it makes me think that ultimately, as you experiment with these different types of questions, you find what works best for you, frankly, and where you feel most comfortable, what style you adopt. And I think that's an important part, is experimenting with these and feeling what fits.
Another great question that we have is, how do you deal with a situation when you detect a question may have hit a nerve?
Yes. So when the question feels like it may have hit a nerve, I think it's most effective to communicate openly about that. And if you haven't asked a permission question before tackling this topic, you can quickly say, I'm sorry, is it okay that I asked you about that? Great question.
I guess could be just a general question, but is there a difference between having a mentor within the company, outside of the company? Like, is there a recommendation?
Well, I think as part of your program with the CPA family, if I can call it that, I think you're paired with a mentor that fits your goals and what you're looking to do. I believe really deeply, actually, that every single relationship has the opportunity for us to learn and grow. And so I would say really that it doesn't matter. In fact, when we think about your role as students and networking, which is another angle where effective questions can be really helpful, every single person that you meet has something that you can learn from.
Mhm.
And that idea of beginner's mind and curiosity underscores that point, and I think provides a great skill for putting that concept into practice. Believing that you can learn something from every person that you connect with and adopting a beginner's mind and really embracing the fact that there's more to learn, I think sets you up really well in all of your relationships, but especially with a mentoring relationship where maybe you feel like, I wish I had someone who was in my company, or I wish I had someone who was outside of my company. Adopt a beginner's mind, and I promise that the relationship will reveal things for you that you didn't expect.
I think that's a great point. And just to add and clarify for students, depending on the pathway that you're reporting your experience in, you can either have a mentor assigned to you, or you can select your own mentor, but it depends on what type of experience also you're reporting. So just wanted to clarify that as well for students.
Great. Thank you. Any last questions? And then we just want to use our last minute to wrap up with takeaways.
Yeah, maybe let's give it a minute to see if anyone else has any questions. Again, students, please feel free to ask questions in the questions section um, of your navigation menu on the right-hand side.
I see one about playback for the presentation. Maybe you want
Yeah,
to just address that
yeah.
one.
So just as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, a recording of this webinar will be sent out to all participants the next day, so it should be tomorrow, end of day. You can also download a copy of this presentation in the handout section, but again, this will be made available to you the next day. And I think the other questions are related specifically to practical experience, so we'll have someone else answer that. But thank you, Taylor, again for this great presentation. So I think the next slide will have your contact details as well.
It will. And a special thing that we like to do as Conversate is to facilitate takeaways, which is just the idea that if there was an aha moment or something, even that you knew already but had been refreshed as part of this presentation, to just spend a moment and think about it. If you have something in front of you where you can write it down or even type it out and email it to yourself, I highly encourage you to do that. Writing it down or even speaking it aloud has been shown to really solidify learning and make it actionable. And so just take a moment, we'll be silent for just a couple seconds. Think to yourself, was there something that stood out, an insight, an aha, or a learning that you want to take away from this discussion. And we'd be happy for you to submit it as a question and share it with everyone as well as your way to write it down. And with that, I thank everybody for joining today. And yes, our contact details are on the final page, so feel free to reach out if we can be of help.
Thank you again, Taylor, for this great presentation. It was very informative. As you've mentioned, this slide also provides your contact details. So if, as students, you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Taylor or to Mollie as well. And the next slide also has contact details for CPA Ontario. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can send us an email. If you have general questions related to practical experience, you can email customer service at cpaontario.ca or practical experience at cpaontario.ca. If you have questions related to finding a mentor or mentor reviews, you can also email mentor at cpaontario.ca. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and a recording of this webinar will be sent to all participants tomorrow.